Welcome back to Ammon Answers Podcast. I'm Aaron Welling. I'm sitting here with Ammon Bundy, candidate for governor. We're coming to you weekly, talk about questions that have come to the campaign that they'd like to hear directly from Ammon. We encourage you, if you've got questions, go ahead and send them in. Ammon's got a busy schedule going around the state trying to do lots of town halls, meet and greets where he can talk to you directly, but we understand it's just not possible to get to everybody. So hopefully this podcast is a tool that can reach some of you that we haven't seen or talked to yet. So go ahead and you can send us your questions for the upcoming podcast that we will add them to the list, and if we got time, we'll get to. So we're going to jump right into this, if you're okay with that.
Let's do it. Yep.
Okay. So the first one is from Sarah. She emailed us saying, who does Ammon support for lieutenant governor and other offices?
So there's a huge list of offices that are going to be voted on this next election. But for sure, I think for Lieutenant Governor, Priscilla Giddings, I like her because she has some backbone. She's willing to fight. She's willing to stand up and say what is right. I think she's running a pretty good campaign, and mostly she's just a principled, honest person. And I think that she has enough, support behind her to be able to beat Scott Bedke, which he's, in my opinion, one of the worst rhinos, establishment, good old boys in the state of Idaho. He's been Speaker of the House for a long time and has no qualms to lie in situations, to be able to, manipulate things and try to control people. And he's got to go, and I think Priscilla Giddings would be a good replacement for him. And I would work with her, and I think it would be a good fit. For Attorney General, I would definitely say Raul Labrador. I know Raul. He's been to my house. He's, I think he's a good person in general. I also like, because there's going to be a lot of fights that the governor's going to have to take, and we're going to need a good Attorney General. They're going to be part of those fights are going to be legal fights, whether we're talking about abortion, whether we're talking about taking back our lands here in Idaho from the federal government. One asset that Raul offers is he's from a territory, Puerto Rico, and I think, they're reaching like 6 million people or so, and the federal government won't let them be a state. They want to keep them as a territory so that they can be under their control. And Raul understands this. He grew up in that situation. He knows the difference between a territory and a state. And he understands that states are supposed to be independent, that they're supposed to, be under the Constitution, not controlled by the federal government. And we've had these conversations, and I think he would make a great Attorney General, especially fighting these battles. So besides that, there's many others that we could talk about, but I'll leave it at that.
Well, that's a perfect segue. We've got two questions. They kind of correlate, so I'll read them both. First one is, how would you retrieve Idaho lands taken by the federal government? That was from Sherry.
Good question.
And then we have another one. Could you give more details on the topic of taking back control of the public lands? First, A lot of people argue with me that you want to sell the public lands for development, which I tell them is an exaggeration.
Yeah, I think those are good questions. So, first of all, we have 32 million plus acres in Idaho controlled by the federal government. It's 63%, give or take 61 to 63% is controlled by the federal government, and about 72% of our subsurface mineral rights, which means basically Idahoans can't use it, we can't benefit from it, and it's causing three major things in Idaho. It's causing our affordable housing crisis to, our housing costs to be out of, just completely outrageous because of supply and demand. It's also causing us to build on our agricultural land, which is the number one industry in Idaho, at least agriculture is. And so now we're destroying our agricultural land. And then it's forcing everybody into the cities to be congested, and when cities become congested, you lose your conservative identity. I don't know why, but statistically it just shows that. So we will truly destroy Idaho if we don't take care and take back our land.
So what does that look like? Because that I think is a good reason why that's important to you and why you're campaigning on that as a main thing. But how do you do it?
Yeah, so great question, because the problems there, We could see them if we don't take care of them, but how do you do it? And so it will be a battle. There will be a legal battle behind what I'm going to propose. But ultimately, if you were to say take a section of the federally controlled land, it's all broken up into the counties. There's sections, and lots all broken up. You can see it. Take a section of that land and go to the county recorders and say, hey, could you show me the title? And she will not be able to show you the title because there is no title, because it's unappropriated lands. I mean, it's never been appropriated to anybody. It's just, and that land constitutionally was supposed to be disposed of to the people. In fact, in Article 4.3 of the Constitution, it says, shall dispose. And so the federal government was supposed to dispose of it. Now, many legal theories, without going too much, and I'm going to wrap this up pretty quick, but there's many legal theories that state that statehood was the disposal, that the federal government disposed of it to the states, and then the states now have jurisdiction over it. And I believe that that is correct. And so what we will do, we will simply appropriate the land. The county and the state have authority to appropriate land, to title land, and we will do that. But now, to alleviate some of the concern for people, remember we're talking about 32 million acres. We'll take a large amount of this land and we will designate it for, hunting, hiking, fishing, what I call multiple use, for public access. And also, when I say multiple use, I'm talking about hunting, hiking, fishing, camping, all of that, but also grazing, logging, mining. Those have all worked together for, centuries. Most of your hunting roads are logging roads, and that's just an example. So they'll be designated and they won't be sold for private property. And then around the towns and the cities, to expand and to alleviate this housing crisis, we'll make that available for the people for disposal. And there'll be some legislation that needs to happen to make sure that it doesn't get disposed of to a large corporation or to a whole, to one single body, to make sure it's disposed of to the people and not to, Bill Gates and that kind of stuff.
Well, and I don't think you're done with that point, but like the way we did it before, the federal government, it was homesteading, right? So there was a requirement. You had to first go claim it, but then you had to improve the land for a certain period of time before ownership was really transferred over.
Yeah.
But the whole point was that it was there and that it took someone that's actually going to commit to that land and actually provide and improve the community which it resides in. So do you envision a plan similar to that? Because like you said, we don't want the Bill Gates or the big corporations. So the best way maybe is to, how do you ensure that that doesn't happen to the
so rules of disposal need to be outlined and legislated before. And there are, like you said, there's been many rules of disposal. Homesteading is just one of them. Desert Industry Act, there are many of them that basically the government was transferring private property into the hands of, or public property into the hands of the private. And I believe that not being able to sell it for like a 5-year period of time, having to improve upon it in some way. Those are all important things for disposal. And those will need to be, worked over and legislated to make sure that we don't cause a big problem. But taking a section, large section of our mountains, our trees, that type of stuff, keeping it public, and then making it so it's multiple use, and then around the cities and the towns and so forth, you make that available for private. And we're talking again about 32 million plus acres.
Right. It's not a small thing. We're not the biggest government holding state of land.
Yeah, we're the third.
We're the third.
You have
top
Nevada, 3. Utah, and then Idaho.
Mm-hmm. Okay, 60% is a lot, no matter how you slice it.
Yep.
That leads us into the next question, which is kind of parallels it. This is from Lori. I would like to know if you have a plan on keeping the Forest Service wildland firefighters, if you plan on getting rid of all the federal land in the state. So this is kind of a question, either is or knows and cares for someone who fits in this employment category. I think it's safe to say that the risks of fire don't go away, right? It just, I'll let you tell us how that.
Well, they do. A lot of the risks go away because you're using your forests. I mean, there's a bumper sticker that, the Eastern Oregon people use quite a bit. I see it in Idaho here that is graze it, log it, or watch it burn, because that's what happens. I mean, you can't leave your front yard without mowing the grass, or it grows up, gets dry, and dies, and then becomes a fire hazard. Well, our forests are the same thing. And that's why we have so many forest fires, because we're not using them. We're not taking care of them. We're not, and same with our, our hills and so forth around here. I mean, if you don't graze it, then it will burn.
It's a resource, can be used for all different matters.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's burning, sometimes it's eating.
In fact, as a little side note, when you're driving through Idaho and you see it looks like there's little lines all over the hills. Well, that's from when the sheep used to graze. Sheep and the cattle used to graze those hills. And so, yeah, but we're always going to need firefighters.
Right.
We don't want our forests to burn up, but the best way is to take care of them. But we're still going to have fires, and you're still going to need firefighters. But I guarantee they're not going to work for the federal government. They're going to work for most likely the county, and that's the way it needs to happen, because there's an extreme amount of waste. I mean, I can't even tell you. Every one of those firefighters that are firefighting for the federal government knows how much waste is involved in that. And so, yeah, we'll tighten it up, but there's going to need to be firefighters, but they're going to work for the state, or they're going to work for the county, however it's worked out. They're not going to work for the federal government.
Yeah, because the federal government won't have control of those lands anymore.
That's correct.
What's really nice about that, too, is, I can see the concerns. We want to make people aware that, you're not – the needs are still there for employment for these types of things.
Yep.
But the cool thing is the decision making will be done locally too. So
That's
whether
correct.
we let it burn because it's good for the environment, it's not happening back east in some think tank. It's actually happening from someone who's in the forests, in the community.
Yeah.
And that's missing right now from the dialogue.
And an individual might have a house or a farm or whatever in these forests, right? They now get to have a say on how they're taken care of. They care about them most, and that's just the reality. And they get to decide. They get to affect how it's taken care of. And this no use policy that the federal government has pushed down upon us just will be gone.
Why don't you tell everyone the story of when your dad notified BLM, Forest Service, whoever it was, of the fire at the ranch, right?
I'm surprised you remember that. Yeah. So there was a fire that started at the ranch where I grew up, and the BLM was notified. I don't think my dad notified them, but they were notified, and it took them 2 days to build this huge movement, and they had hundreds of vehicles down in Mesquite, which is the closest town, and they were down there and filling up the restaurants and filling up the hotels and all that. Meanwhile, the ranch is burning, and my dad wasn't going to wait for it. He wasn't going to let the range burn. So he gets on a bulldozer, and he goes out there, and in less than 24 hours, he puts out the fire himself. And about the time he gets it put out, then here comes this army of, Forest Service
Right.
and BLM firefighters up there. And he was like, well, he was literally on his way back, parking the, equipment and all that. And that's just a reality. So they probably spent several $1 million just getting out there.
Right.
And my dad, at his own expense, put the fire out.
Right.
And that's story is not isolated. That's not just something that.
Right.
But in fact, part of what happened to the Hammonds in Oregon, where they were prosecuted in part because they were putting out fires, and they were costing the, firefighters a lot of money because they were putting out the fire so efficiently that was part of the dispute and the reason why they went after the Hammonds.
Because they were losing revenue.
They were losing revenue.
Yeah. That's interesting. Let's switch this from state, because as a governor, there'll be interactions with the Fed.
Yeah.
Right? And so just in the last day or so, we've got this new thing from the White House. Our vaccines works against the Omicron, especially for people who get booster shots when they are eligible. If you're vaccinated, you could test positive, but if you get the COVID, your case will likely be asymptomatic or mild. We're intent on not letting Omicron disrupt work and school for the vaccinated. That's a little alarming right there.
For the vaccinated.
Yeah. You've done the right thing, and we will get through this. For the unvaccinated, you're looking at a winter of severe illness and death for yourselves, your families, and the hospitals you may soon overwhelm. And I mean, anyway, so
is that a prediction or a threat? I mean, for the unvaccinated, you're looking at a winter of severe illness and death for yourselves, your families. What? I mean, who talks like that? This is coming from our administration in the White House. That's pretty crazy.
It's alarming, for sure. But you're now going to be, you get elected. You're now Governor Bundy of the state of Idaho. You're going to now have to interact with this White House.
Well, so one thing that I'll have to interact, I guess, in some way, obviously, but our founders made it very clear that the states are to check and balance the federal government, and a governor is supposed to do that. He is supposed to make sure that the people of the state are not being, and their rights are not being trampled on by the federal government. And that's something we haven't had for a long, long time, and why the federal government thinks they can do whatever they want to do. In fact, if you go back to September, this is when President Biden announced that employers of 100 and more employees have to force vaccinations on them. And he says things to me that are very concerning, just like he did in this message. He says the vast majority of Americans are doing the right thing, he says. That 25% can cause a lot of damage, and they are. That's what he's saying. Then he goes on, my message to the unvaccinated Americans is this. What more is there to wait for? We've been patient, but our patience is wearing thin, and your refusal has cost all of us. What he's doing very clearly is isolating a certain group of the people in this country. And that is a very dangerous thing. Political warfare is literally isolate, demonize, and then destroy. That's been the political warfare that's been taking place for thousands of years. And that's what they're playing here. They're looking to isolate.
Yep.
Then they'll demonize, or, they do that simultaneously. And what for? Well, let's look at examples. And, people don't like to compare. They don't like to go back to Nazi Germany because everybody seems to do it. But there's a great lesson there. And maybe if we don't want to use that when we're talking about isolating the Jews, well, let's talk about Stalin. He isolated the Ukrainians in the very same way. He created the small group of people, minority of people, and then he said how terrible they were to the rest of the people in the country. They demonized them. And then what did they do? Then they began to destroy them, restrict them, take their rights away. I mean, it became very devastating for that group of people. And if we're not careful, I believe that that's what they're doing. And it will take a governor, a state, to say, look, you are not going to do that here. You are not going to isolate the people. You're not going to demonize them. And you're not going to try to destroy them and their rights. And if we could do that on a state level, I think it can be done peacefully. Otherwise, people have to hunker down in their homes and in their little communities and just try to fight this massive federal government. It needs to happen at the state level, and the governor needs to be the one to push it and do it. That's his duty.
And we see a good example of that in Florida, right? I guess just recently, and I haven't really paid attention to national news, but I heard something about, and I know that the Fed has been doing this for a long time. They're just dumping refugees of different types in different states and say, you got to deal with it. And my understanding, I heard that he's actually flying them to New Hampshire, I think is where he's sending them. But his standing on, I have a duty to the citizens of Florida, and we have needs that we have to pay for. People need these things, and we have budgets for that. We didn't account for these 100,000 people you just dumped on us. So we're seeing that. Are there any things that you're seeing that you're like, hey, this is working, or hey, this is a good idea, but it needs this type of twist?
Well, so if we go back to federal funding, taking federal money, we look at like what Brad Little has done in Idaho. He's taken billions and billions of dollars of federal funding, and he's done that with strings attached. And strings like, well, we'll take immigrants in no matter what circumstance, as long as, if the federal government says it, we'll just do it. Or we will mandate, vaccinations, or we will mandate, masks in our school. These are all things that Governor Little agreed to in order to get federal money, billions of dollars of federal money. And that process has to stop. And it's not just happening on a state level. It's happening on a county level, your health districts, your school boards, even your hospitals, your many corporations are all taking this federal money and signing these memorandums of understandings that basically obligate them to force whatever the White House says.
Right.
And that is an extreme problem that we have in Idaho. It's all over the country, but in Idaho. And our founders termed it as putting the states and the people in undue obedience. And it's done through federal funding. So as governor, I will, fight that process of federal funding coming down into our schools, into our corporations, into our governments, stopping that process so that people can be free to keep their own money and also to make their own decisions according to how they want to make them.
Beautiful. We've got a couple more questions. I'll jump in here.
When I first read this from the White House, I guess I couldn't believe they're using that terminology. I thought this surely must be a fake, tweet or whatever statement. And to find out that it really is, and that he's using those terminologies, talking about, a certain group of people because, isolating them, that they're going to have a winter of severe illness and death, which the reality, to be honest with you, actually, to not get off that, the reality is just opposite. And so, I don't know what Biden's talking about.
Well, he was very clear. He says, you may get it, but it will be really mild.
Yeah, well, the reality, though, is with Omicron that it's all mild. It doesn't matter whether you're vaccinated or not vaccinated. But what is the benefit of being vaccinated if it's not going to protect you? So, Cornell University did another thing. There was like 900 new COVID cases there, and they're all vaccinated, and the list goes on and on and on. So just on a practicality, this is just not making sense. And for him to use that terminology, I think is just political warfare. He's just isolating a certain group of people. He's demonizing them. And I wonder what his plans are once he can get the American people to look down upon this 25% here. What is he planning on doing with them? What's the next steps? And history proves that it's really not a very good thing. So they isolated a group of people, they demonized them, and then they actually destroyed them. And it is literally the steps of political warfare.
A little terrifying. All right, this is the Danish American warrior. What is your thoughts on those that are formally charged with a felony being unable to obtain a CCP, a concealed carry permit, as well as constitutional carry? I was overcharged and ended up pleading to a misdemeanor.
Yeah, so what we have here, and the CCPs are one is everybody can open carry here, unless technically you're a felon. Mm-hmm. Well, but I'll give you something that happened to me personally. So I was released from federal prison. I was completely innocent on all charges in both trials, walked out without even a misdemeanor. Almost a year or so later, I want to go buy a new gun. I go into D&B Supply to buy a new gun, and I'm denied. So the FBI, on their background check, or whatever, the NICS, what I think is what it's called, denied me. And it was a full denial, meaning I could not buy a gun. Well, so I did a video, made a big old, stink about it, and the next morning, the FBI calls D&B Supply in Emmett, Idaho, and says, "Hey, Ammon Bundy can buy a gun." And so they call me, and I go down there, and I could go through the process now. So they give me permission, right? Well, why was I denied in the first place? Because I was found not guilty on all charges. I walked out. I never even had a misdemeanor. And so that means somebody in the background, a bureaucrat, is not basing it upon the law. They're not basing it upon, whether someone was convicted or not. It's not innocent until proven guilty. It's just some bureaucrats deciding they don't like that person, or that that person they think shouldn't have a gun for whatever reason. And that's not the rule of law. That is not the way this country should run. Now, to add to this story, I go back about a year later to buy another gun, and I was put on hold for a week. This was at Sportsman Warehouse, and so I had to wait. I waited. They called me back, say, hey, it's been approved. I go back in. I get the gun. They give it to me, and I'm about ready to leave, and I see another gun that I like. So I decide I want to buy that. So they do a background check on me, and they denied me. I literally left. I was denied at the counter, and I left with a gun and left the store. So again, I don't know what happened. Maybe they found out, oh, I bought a gun. And then later they said, oh, we made a mistake and denied me. But again, not convicted of anything. And still there's this bureaucratic process. And that's what's happening to most of the processes with government. They're being controlled by the bureaucrats, not by the rule of law. And the bureaucrats are deciding when to implement force or to stop somebody from having a gun or whatever. They're doing that without, due process, without people being found guilty, without going through the process to determine whether someone has actually done something wrong or right. And that's a very dangerous thing. And this individual here is experiencing that. They're just experiencing the effects of the bureaucrats. And
the bureaucrats was the judicial system, the prosecutor trumping up charges high so that they'll negotiate for something lower, which is still a charge, which is commonplace in the legal field.
Yeah, well, and really what it boils down to is we have already decided long time ago, a couple 100 years plus ago, that a person was not supposed to be punished unless they had been given due process and found guilty. And that is going away. That's almost gone, actually. That's why you have people like, that were at the Capitol building January 6th that are still in prison today. They're not being offered due process. They're not being given a speedy trial, and they're not being offered bail either. It's just a bureaucrat saying we're going to hold them in here and punish them. And no matter what happens on the back end, we still got our 2 years or our 1 year, out of them. And this is not the way this country was established. This is not the way the force of law is supposed to be implemented. It's supposed to be implemented by the people, a jury, determining that there was somebody that was guilty, and therefore the force of law can then force them to do whatever the sentencing is, not the other way around.
So you're on the docket for the executive branch of government. You don't get to make laws. You're not the judicial branch where you have to find, people whether they're guilty of such crimes. So what is your role? And I'm kind of baiting you because what you said before, you're like, I need a good attorney general because there's going to be a lot of legal battles, right? The biggest problem from we'll call it a lay citizen's perspective is like, I'm accountable if my taillight's burnt out. I'm accountable if I am late on my county tax, federal tax, state, whatever. At every level, I am accountable, and there are consequences. Instant financial, sometimes prison sentences, right? But we're not seeing that as the norm with anyone in government from all levels. Yeah. So as Bundy, Governor Bundy, what would you do in the state of Idaho to help guide that scene? You're the executive, but you don't get to run that side.
Well, so yeah, I'm the executive. I'd be the head of the executive branch, and the judicial branch is an equal branch to the executive branch. The governor has very little influence. It should have hardly any influence over the judicial branch. Same with the legislative branch. However, who are the prosecutors? They're under the executive branch. Like when you're talking about the state police and so forth, and the detectives and all that, that's all under the executive branch on a state level. And including your grand juries and so forth. So those are all in the executive branch. And so, you begin to say, look, we're not going to prosecute this type of action, if you will. because it's not a true crime. Then the governor has quite a bit of influence over that. Also, because the governor is the executive branch puts forth the law. That's their job. The legislatures make the law, and the governor puts it forth, and the judicial branch interprets it or determines it. And so that's the process, or really I shouldn't say interpret. There'll be a lot of people that would disagree with me. They basically go through the process of giving someone due process and handle that. So anyway, yeah, the governor does have a lot of effect on that. Plus, the governor can, literally has a bully pulpit to say, look, we need to stop doing this. We need to implement justice in our state, not political warfare. That's what needs to happen. And a lot of influence just simply on a political level can happen.
So that could take us into a lot of different rabbit trails, that little thing we went there. I don't think we got time for that on this podcast. We've basically got most of the questions. Some of them were similar, but I think we got all of those. Are there something else that you want to talk about on this show?
No, I think we ought to wrap it up, and people can send in more questions, and we'll do this again next week. And maybe we can just keep this going and this become a forum for people to ask the hard questions, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks for being with us. We're going to try to do this every week, like we said. We may not do it next week because your campaign manager said that we're lightening your load these next 2 weeks for the holidays.
All right.
We may not see you guys next week, but we wish everyone a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And until next time, thanks for joining us.